Well, thank you all very much for coming. I suspect you're not here to see me, though. And I'm cool with that. A big part of my marketing strategy was to choose someone who I knew would do something really controversial so that all the photographers would turn up. And all I have to say is that MSNBC's loss is my gain. So... the first question that people usually ask me about this book is why I wrote it, because I'm English and I'm not American. So why would I be drawn not only to write about an American, but also to write about Pat Buchanan? And the answer to that, well, the answer to the American bit is fairly simple. I'm passionately in love with America. It's a very exciting, dynamic country. It's a country where it's still got a revolution that's still rolling on for 300 years. It's got a few problems lately, but I think it's still strong. And the way I always phrase it is, Britain is like my crusty old wife, and America is my sexy young mistress. And although I see as much of my mistress as I possibly can, financial reasons always draw me back to my wife. But the reason why I wanted to write about Pat, well, I only discovered why I'd written about Pat retrospectively. I stumbled upon him as a historical figure quite by accident. Like a lot of people of my generation, I spend about a third of my day on YouTube. And while I was going through the usual videos of sneezing pandas and frolicking monkeys, by sheer chance, and it really was luck, I came across a speech that Mr. Buchanan gave in 1992 at the Republican National Convention. You might be familiar with it. It's the so-called culture war speech. And if you watch that, regardless of your politics, you cannot but help but be struck by the extraordinary rhetorical and moral force of that speech, in which Pat declared that America was in the grip of a cultural war, a religious war, as important to the future of America as the Cold War, for it is a war for America's soul. With that speech, I would argue, Pat Buchanan defined the politics of the 1990s, and in many ways the 90s is as much the age of Buchanan as it is the age of Bill Clinton. So I saw that, I was fascinated, I wanted to know more about him. So I applied for some money to the people who make washing machines, the Leverhulme Foundation, and they gave me some money to come to America and to travel around and do some interviews. And I'm terrified of flying, so it was actually quite an extraordinary experience. I flew out to Los Angeles, I interviewed some crazy libertarians there, and then I took a train to Kansas, interviewed a few people there, then I took a train up to Detroit, interviewed some Teamster types there. Then I took a train to New Hampshire and interviewed some Buchanan Brigade people there. And then I went right down to the South and interviewed some sons of Confederate veterans. I'm sure there are a few of them around. It's amazing they're still living. Sons of Confederate veterans. And I interviewed those people, and then I came up to D.C., and I was very fortunate to be able to interview Mr. Buchanan himself. And those interviews really do form the kind of spine and the heart and soul of the book. And in the course of writing this, I reached two conclusions about Pat Buchanan. The first one is that his life is really a biography of the conservative movement. He was born in the greatest of great ages, perhaps the last great age that the West will ever see. He was born in 1938 to an enormous family, 6 brothers and 2 sisters. Is that right? Almost a Romney-sized family. He was a Roman Catholic at a time when it was pretty cool to be a Catholic. This was an age of the Rosary Crusades, when thousands of people would gather in football stadiums to pray for the conversion of Russia. This was an age in which America was very confident and was growing and had this enormous industrial base. He grew up in the shadow of McCarthyism. His father was a convert from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party because of the communist issue. And Pat grew up in Washington, D.C., right at the very heart of power. He was even a caddy to a young Richard Nixon when he was vice president. He then became a journalist. He met Nixon. Nixon took him on. Pat was by his side when Nixon reinvented himself for the 112th time in 1966. And he was with him as well in 1968 when Nixon won that incredibly close election to go on to become president. And then Pat was there at the heart of the Nixon administration as a speechwriter at a time of extraordinary cultural conflict when America perhaps came closest to civil war as it had done for 100 years. Remarkable time. He is one of the very few people who emerged out of the Nixon administration and out of Watergate with a clean reputation. And Tom Braden, your colleague on Crossfire, once remarked that Pat Buchanan was the only former member of the Nixon administration who didn't require a letter from his parole officer to go on TV. Pat then went on to become one of the nation's first professional right-wing TV pundits. He helped invent a show called Crossfire, which radically changed the way in which right-wing people appear on the media. In times past, conservatives tended to be a bit like William F. Buckley, very sophisticated, quite polite, quite sort of, I don't want to imply that Pat isn't intellectual, but very, very much dealing with that kind of high realm of ideas. Buckley is as much likely to talk about ancient, you can also imagine him doing an interview in ancient Greek or something. And then Pat comes on and he brings the style of ordinary rough and tumble politics into TV right-wing punditry, and it really does revolutionize it. And it's from that you get the legacy of Ann Coulter and Sean Hannity and even Glenn Beck. Pat then worked under Ronald Reagan. He was his director of communications during the Iran-Contra scandal. He then left the Reagan administration, became a private citizen, became a great pundit, great columnist, and in the 1990s ran 3 times for the presidency. I want to discuss that a little bit later with Pat. And during that time became really the face of the conservative base within the Republican Party and of conservative Middle America. So Buchanan's life, if you want to do a history of the conservative movement in America, you'd do very well to read Pat Buchanan's life. It's a very good primer into it. The second conclusion that I reached was that Buchananism was as much a social force as it was an ideology. That the kind of people who were drawn in the 1990s to campaign for Pat Buchanan were as much a reflection of a particular time and a particular demography as they were of a set of ideas. In 1996, when Pat Buchanan won New Hampshire, the New Hampshire primary, which is probably kind of the high point of his presidential career, his voters were the poorest, the most likely to have been unemployed, the most likely to be independents. He very often won the male independent vote, and crucially, the most likely to have been previously registered as a Democrat. So Pat Buchanan's vote was exactly the kind of vote that Republicans chase nowadays, defecting Democrats, people angry with the status quo. And I think if you grasp that, if you understand the historical importance of Buchanan, then you better understand where the Tea Party comes from and where the kind of politics of today comes from. Because historians, if you read all the literature at the moment, history books tend to finish at 1980. They tend to stop with the Reagan Revolution as if that's it for the right. And that's not true. It's in the 1990s that the South seriously turns Republican at a congressional level. It's only much later that they turn Republican at a state level. And Buchananism is all about that. If you want to understand the Tea Party, you have to understand the roots that were laid down in the 1990s. So as a result of all these travels and a result of these conclusions, in retrospect, I realized why it was I had been drawn to write about Pat Buchanan. And the answer is that many of the issues that he's concerned by and that have motivated him are global and international. I grew up in a family that's very much part of that middle American demographic. It just happened to be in the southeast of England. My father was what in England we call C2. That's so English. We don't give people great names like blue collar. We give them numbers. And in Britain, my father was what they call C2, which is a skilled worker. He was a guy who laid cables in the ground. And he was made unemployed. Globalization and deregulation and all the dramatic economic changes of the last 30 years, they affected him. And growing up, I experienced 2 years of joblessness in my household, and I saw a great man brought low. And I understand the kind of people who Buchanan reached out to. And I understand that those people, and I suspect that those people, in their heart of hearts, although they quite often vote Democrat, they're really rather conservative, because the things that matter to them, like family, like faith, like the place they grew up in, their job, their stability, those are conservative issues. I think that's something that Pat Buchanan got in the 1990s that many Republicans, including the people running for the presidency today, don't entirely get. And I will just finish very briefly before I'd like to go on and talk to Pat. I'll finish very briefly by saying that regardless of what you think of Pat's ideology or his views on any issue, I think he's only ever been motivated by duty and by love. And there are very few politicians you can say that about.